Good morning. Well, I hope you will agree with me this morning when I say that I am not an old man. But at the risk of sounding like an old man, life is expensive now, isn't it? And it's really hit me over the last couple of years just how expensive everything in life seems to be becoming. And I'm going to show that I'm not an old man, but I'm getting there when I say that I can remember when a litre of unleaded fuel cost 80 pence versus what it costs now. And I remember my first car, I used to be able to fill that up in just under £30, which was amazing. And I also remember how I used to be able to go to the cinema on a Friday night when I was younger, and it would cost me £3.50 for my ticket. And I went to the cinema in London a couple of years ago, and it cost me £18 for my ticket. And that wasn't even in one of the fancy chairs. That was in one of the scummy chairs, over on the side. So I haven't been to the cinema in London for a while as a result. And the average age of a first-time house buyer now in the UK is about 30 years old. In London, it's more like 35 to 40. And actually, in the more expensive areas of the country, like London and like parts of the southeast here, the average single first-time buyer will need to save up for about 17 years after they start working to be able to afford a 15% deposit on a house, which is crazy. And by 2037, the eligibility age for retirement in this country will be 68. And so, those in my generation and in younger generations may actually not feasibly be able to fully retire due to affordability. And so from whatever angle we look at it right now in this country and in modern society, life is really expensive. And I don't think there's ever been a more pressing time for us as Christians to therefore assess kind of where our hearts are when it comes to finances, and to make sure that we have a really biblical and a really Jesus-focused mindset when it comes to how we spend our cash. And we often joke as a leadership team that whoever has to preach the sermon on finance has got the short straw. That's because we're British, and we don't really like talking about money, and it makes us all feel a bit uncomfortable. But this morning I really wanted to actually speak on this topic, because I think it's so important that if we are saying Jesus is the center of our life, that we also position ourselves in a way that Jesus can be the center of our finances as well. Whether we are earning minimum wage or whether we're investment bankers earning in the millions. If there are any of those here, by the way, I'd love to become friends with you afterwards. But money, if we're not careful, money can really take over our lives, and we can become irrational, and we can become kind of obsessed with it if we don't protect our hearts against it. And I'll give you an example from something that happened to me in the last few weeks. And my car was due to go in for a service a few weeks ago, so I dropped it in to the garage, and I had a courtesy car for the day. And the general etiquette when you have a courtesy car is that you take it back with the same level of fuel that you had when you picked it up. Otherwise, you get charged for it. So I checked the mileage that was on there, and I thought, okay, that's fine. I'm not going very far. So I drove home, and then later on I came to bring the car back, and I worked out that I'd probably used about £5 worth of fuel during the day. So I went to the garage on the way back, filled up, and I put in £5. And then I got in to pay, and the guy said, that's £7.50. And I thought, well, how's that possible? And he said, oh, you must have been looking at the litre ticking over rather than the pounds ticking over. So I'd actually put in more fuel than I needed. And when I got back to the car, the extra £2.50 had made a big difference to the mileage. So I was going to be dropping the car back off with, £2.50 more petrol in than when I picked it up. And this distressed me greatly. So what I decided to do was I drove the whole way from Whitfield back to Canterbury in fourth gear to try and burn off as much of that extra £2 as possible, because I just couldn't give the car back with £2 extra fuel in than when I picked it up. And we can become kind of obsessive, and we can become irrational with money if we don't sort of guard our hearts against it. And I couldn't find the UK figures, but in the US, 1 in 4 adults claim that money is the single thing they think about most on a daily basis. So more than their friends, more than their families, more than their sports teams, and more than their God, if they believe in God. And I'm sure the figures in the UK are probably quite similar, because there is all of this financial pressure on us today. But that cannot be good, that cannot be healthy, and that cannot be the way that God intended us to live our lives. So I think it's really important that we learn to take control of the temptation to allow money to control us. I think that's really important for us as Christians. And for some of us, that will involve a transformation of mindset. And so as we continue this series on transformation this morning, we're going to be looking specifically at what that means for finances. And money's mentioned a lot in the Bible. It's actually mentioned over 800 times, all in. And Jesus often taught through parables, which were stories that he used to teach lessons. And of all the parables that Jesus tells, over half of them involve money in some way. So there's lots of really good teaching in the Bible around money. And this morning I want to look at a passage in the New Testament in Matthew 6, verses 19 to 24. And this is an extract from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which is probably one of the most famous sermons ever preached, if not the most famous sermon ever preached. And it really is Jesus laying out some of the real foundational attitudes that we as Christians should adopt. So I'm going to read this, and hopefully it will come up behind me as well. And it's titled Treasures in Heaven. And it says, "Do not store up for yourself treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, then your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate one and you will love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." Nobody can serve two masters. And Jesus says you cannot serve both God and money. And as always, he's absolutely right. And as Christians, we therefore have a decision to make as to which one we serve. And I think it's really healthy, therefore, for us to take kind of a regular temperature check on where our heart is on this stuff. And I think it's important, therefore, that we as a church talk about it regularly and that we preach about it regularly as well. And I think for us to kind of understand that, we need to really understand what Jesus means when he says serve, when he uses the phrase serve. And to understand that deeper, we kind of need to look in the Bible. And in the book of Mark, Jesus says, "The Son of Man," meaning him, "came not to be served, but to serve." And we see in the way that Jesus lived out his life on the earth that he put himself before others. And he went out of his way to not build up treasure for himself, but to serve other people. And the kind of culmination of that really is on the cross, when Jesus gives his body and gave his life in order that we might have life for all the wrongdoing of mankind. And we use the word serve in church. So we talk about serving in different teams. So you might serve on the worship team, or you might serve in the cafe team, or serve in the car parking team. And we use that word very intentionally. Because actually, when we serve in any of those capacities, we are laying down things of ourselves in order to lift others up. So we're laying down our time, we're laying down our energy, we're laying down our giftings in order to hand them over to somebody else. And this is an attitude that Jesus models in the way that he lived his life. And therefore, it's something that we have to embrace. And what he means when he says you cannot serve both God and money, therefore, is that you cannot lay down your life for both of those things. You cannot find your ultimate purpose, you cannot find your ultimate passion in both God and in money. You have to pick one or the other. And I recently listened to a sermon by a guy called Stephen Foster, who's one of the preachers at HTB in London. And he was preaching on finance, and he said something that I thought was really interesting and quite poignant. And he said, if you want to know what you are passionate about, then look at your bank statement, because it doesn't lie. And I think that's totally right. And I've learned this over the last few months since getting married, and not just because a wife is the most expensive thing you can have, but actually because my wife is really into spreadsheets. So we now run our life off a spreadsheet, which has everything you can imagine on there. So any cost that might go out is on this Excel spreadsheet. So our mortgage, our utility bills, our phone bills, car payments, down to as trivial things as our Netflix accounts. This is listed on this Excel spreadsheet. And also what goes on there is the tithes, so what we give to the church, and also the money that we try and save every month. And then from that, that figure is then subtracted from our combined salaries, and that gives us a disposable income figure for the month. So it's pretty intense. But actually, what Stephen Foster says is true, because if you looked at that spreadsheet, you would soon get a bit of a view of the kind of things that Mariam and I are passionate about. You would see Mariam's gym membership, which is very important to her. You would see my Sky Sports subscription, which is very important to me. But then if you go a layer deeper and you actually go into how we spend our disposable income, you get even more of a picture of actually what's really important to us. You would see Mariam's passion for clothes come through quite clearly. clothes and shopping would probably be up there at the top. For me, it's the total opposite. She always tells me that I don't wear nice clothes and I should buy more clothes, but I've used all my disposable income on, playing squash and buying food generally. So that's kind of where my passion seems to lie. And I think, if you guys were to go home and look at your bank statements, you'd probably start to pick up a bit of a view of actually what's really important to you. If you looked at my dad's, you would see that he's passionate about guitars. If you were to look at Jack King's, you would probably see his passion for Texan women on there. I want to just clarify that. Jack is engaged to a Texan woman, so I'm talking about flights to and from Texas. And if we all looked at our spending, we would pick up the things that actually are really important to us. So the big question, therefore, for us as Christians is kind of where does God fit into all of that? If that's the reality, that actually the way we spend our money, kind of is an image of where our passion lies, then where does Jesus fit into all of that? And those of you that attend this church regularly will be very used to what happened in the second song this morning when the baskets go round, and we very intentionally give people a regular opportunity to contribute financially to the work that goes on in the church. And many people do that on a Sunday morning, many people do it online and in various other ways. But we do that because it's a really biblical principle to do that. And we refer to it as tithing, and the word tithe literally means a tenth. And this goes back to the Old Testament where the Israelites, who were God's chosen people, were required to give a tenth of what they had back to God, which was often in the form of kind of agricultural produce at the time. And some people think that that's kind of an Old Testament thing that isn't really relevant for us anymore today, but Jesus addresses and endorses the tithe as well in the New Testament. In Matthew 23, he addresses it fairly directly, where he's actually rebuking some of the religious leaders at the time who give their tithe, who bring their tenth, but actually lack a whole bunch of other things that are really important for spiritual and godly leaders. Things like being faithful and being just in the way that they behaved. And what Jesus says to them is, you should have practiced the latter, but without neglecting the former. So you should have practiced all those good godly behaviors without neglecting the financial contribution as well. And I think that today in modern society, with all of this added financial pressure that we all feel, there can be a temptation for us as Christians to practice the latter but neglect the former. And to prioritize being good people and being good Christians in society, which is hugely important, by the way, but actually neglecting an equally important instruction that we get in the Bible around how we deal with our money. And what I'm about to say it's not a particularly easy thing to say, and it might not be a particularly easy thing to hear, but I hope that it will be taken in the heart that it's intended, which is not a judgmental one. But if you were to look at the financials of our church, and we kind of display this information pretty publicly at the end of every financial year, where we show the money that's kind of come in and that's gone out of the church and how it's been spent. And if you look at the money that came in through tithes last year, and then you look at the number of people that attend this church regularly who would claim to be committed Christians, it doesn't make for great reading. And that's not an easy thing to say, and like I say, it's certainly not a judgmental thing. But it doesn't make good reading. The actual maths don't. And there might be tons of different reasons for that. And it's not for me to judge or even to know, frankly, because I don't see and would never want to see the details of who pays what in this church. Only our finance team see that. And we as leaders don't ever look at that together, very intentionally. But actually, we have to accept at the very kind of core of that fact, there could be something a bit concerning there. Because money reveals what's important to us. And this is why Jesus talks about it so much. Jesus doesn't talk about money loads because money's important to him. He talks about money loads because it's important to us. And therefore it reveals something of what's going on in our hearts. I'll say that again. Jesus doesn't talk about money loads because it's important to him. He talks about it loads because it matters to us. And therefore it indicates something of what's going on in our hearts. And I have definitely not always got this right, by any means. And I was very fortunate to grow up in a Christian home, and my parents were really faithful tithers. And we had quite a big family. There were 5 kids, and we didn't always have tons of disposable income floating around. But I saw my parents work really hard, and I saw them tithe really faithfully when I was growing up. And as a result of that, we never went without. But then when I came to start my working life, and I left school and I started my first job, and it wasn't the best paid job in the world, as first jobs never are, but as I started my first job, for the first 2 years, I didn't actually tithe. And at the time, the reason that I didn't tithe was I didn't think I had enough money to tithe. Because overnight, after getting my first job, my parents became incredibly cruel and decided that I had to pay them board to live in their house. So I got my paycheck and I gave some money across to my parents and paid my car insurance and paid my Xbox subscription. Life was pretty complicated back then. And by the time I'd done a few of these things, I didn't feel that then, once I'd saved a little bit as well, that I actually had anything left over. And I really convinced myself that that was the case. But actually, when I look back now, I can see that I had enough money to go out with my friends whenever they went out. And I very rarely had to turn down, a social gathering or anything like that because I didn't have the money. And I was driving around an old sports car that wasn't particularly cheap to insure and wasn't particularly cheap to run. And so, despite the fact I'd kind of convinced myself I didn't have enough money to tithe, the reality when I look back, and it's not an easy thing to say, but when I look back, clearly at that point in my life, I was more passionate about the car that I was driving than I was about putting Jesus at the real center of my finances. And it wasn't the last time I had to learn lessons about the hold that money can take on us. But in recent years, God has really challenged me on this. And now it's the first payment that goes out on my bank account after I get paid, is the tithe to the church. Because I don't think now, in where I'm at in my life and in where I'm at in my faith, I could actually look at myself in the mirror, knowing that I pay my Sky Sports subscription and whatever else I might do, but don't give anything back financially to God and to his church. Because God was so passionate and so generous towards me that he gave even his son on a cross. Even his only son he put on a cross because his heart was so generous towards me. The other thing about money is that money kind of shows us what we're prepared to suffer for. And I don't know about you, but when I get to the end of my working week, I sometimes feel like I've had to suffer for that this week. I sometimes feel like, gosh, I've really crawled over the finish line there this week, and I'm sure many of you could empathize with that. But we go through that and we put ourselves through that in order to have money. And therefore, how we spend the money kind of shows what we're prepared to suffer for. But also, when we choose to invest our money in one area, then the knock-on effect of that is that we end up with a shortage to spend in a different area. That's just life. We prioritize things and we choose where to invest and where to be left short. And I'll give you another real-life example of this. So my brother Ashley went through a period of probably about 2 years where he wore the most disgusting pair of trainers I've ever seen in my life. Like, these things stunk. They were brown, they were falling apart, they were ripped at the seams. And I said, Ash, why don't you just buy yourself some new trainers? And he said, well, the thing is, whenever I get paid, I look at what I've got to spend, and I think I could buy new trainers, or I could buy a new piece of drumming equipment. And actually, I'm really passionate about drumming, and I can't bring myself to spend the money on the new trainers. So in the end, Mariam and I bought him a new pair for his birthday, because we just couldn't deal with it anymore. But he was prepared to suffer in the footwear department in order to invest in the drumming department, because that was where his real passion lied. And I believe that in all forms of true service, so in all forms of kind of laying things down in order that someone else might be able to pick them up, or something else might pick them up, I believe in all forms of service there is a cost associated with that. And as I mentioned earlier on, when we serve on teams in church, there is a cost to that. And the guys, for example, that are on our setup team here, who meet at the Living Well Church in Lyddon to load up the van on a Sunday morning at 8 a.m, and then they come up here to make sure we're ready for 9:30, and then they stay after this second meeting to pack down and get it all back to Lyddon. Like, those guys feel the cost of that. Because the cost is actually half of their Sunday's gone, for a start, but also there's tiredness, there's fatigue, there are things that come as a result of that service. And actually, when we serve God with our money, it's no different. And if there isn't a cost to us to prioritize Jesus with our finances, then there's probably no point in really doing it. And last year, Mariam and I got married and bought a house in the same year, and it is by far the most expensive year we've ever had and likely ever will have. And we really had to budget on a monthly basis. We really had to look at what we were spending and be really kind of, aggressive about where we put that money. And trust me, the easy thing last year would have been not to tithe for us. And there was a little part of me, tiny little part right at the back of my mind, that when I was transferring the tithes across every month was thinking, that would pay for X amount of dinners at the wedding. Or that would be X amount of the band cost at the wedding. Or that would fill the oil tank at the house. And there was a cost associated with us tithing last year. And as a result of that, it meant we had to make some sacrifices. One of those was I didn't let Mariam turn the heating on in the house until December, because we had this oil tank outside. We've got an old house with an oil tank, and it costs about £500 to fill the oil tank up. And we thought, if we can just get past the wedding before we have to do that, then that's £500 we could spend on something else for the wedding. So we didn't do that, and she wrapped herself up in a blanket for a few months instead. And then also a friend of mine from school got engaged and was getting married in Austin, in Texas, in November of last year, pretty much a month before our wedding. And he was a close friend of mine, and we were both very keen to go. But when we looked at the finances and what it was going to cost to fly out there and get the accommodation sorted and all that sort of stuff, it just wasn't financially viable for us to do it. If we hadn't tithed for a couple of months, we could have done it. But we decided, actually, this isn't the right decision. And in the end, I just went without Mariam instead. He was my school friend, okay? One of us had to stay. But there was a cost associated last year for us with tithing. We felt the effect of that. And this is why Jesus was so irritated with the religious leaders of the time who gave their tithe, they gave their tenth, but actually there wasn't a cost for them in that. It wasn't difficult for them to do that. What was difficult for those guys was to actually display these characteristics of good, godly leaders that Jesus was asking for. To be faithful and to be just in how they behaved. That was the bit that cost them something. And so that was the bit that Jesus was more interested in. And this is a really important point, because Jesus isn't the least bit interested in who in this church gives the most amount of money. He couldn't be less interested in all of that. And actually, we can fall into the trap sometimes of thinking, well, of course you can tithe because you've got this job, or you've got that job, or you have this circumstance or that circumstance, or you have less children than me. Whatever it is, we can fall into the trap of kind of justifying why someone else is in a better position to give financially than we are. But actually, if we fall into that trap, then we are doing just that. We're falling into a trap and we are buying into a lie. Because of course, if somebody earns a six-figure salary here, then they have more money to give than somebody who's on minimum wage. That goes without saying. But Jesus could not care less about that. And we know that really clearly from another passage in the Bible in the New Testament, in Mark and chapter 12, where we read this. It says, Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor woman has put more into the treasury than all of the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." And here Jesus is sat in the treasury area of the temple, and people are coming and going, and they're giving financially back to God. And when I've read this in the past, I kind of imagined people coming in with huge bags of money. These flamboyant rich people coming in and making a big song and dance about pouring their sack of money into the bowl. But as I've researched that more over the last few weeks, I think that's pretty unlikely that was the way it sort of unraveled. Because what many historians believe is that actually at this time there would have probably been a container with a really small slit in the top for you to slip in the money. So it was quite a subtle process, and it's extremely unlikely that there was somebody there counting the money as it went in and shouting out the amounts that various people paid. So that's important, because what it tells us is that nothing is hidden from Jesus. And actually Jesus knew in that situation not just how much money people were giving, but far more importantly, he knew the heart behind what they were giving. And he says about this woman, this poor widow has put in more than any of the others. And if you go back to the original text, the 2 coins that she put in were the smallest coins in circulation in the currency at the time. So the equivalent today would be the smallest coin in circulation for us is a 1p. So she's put 2 1-penny coins in, and Jesus says she's put in more than any of the others. And there will be people in this church who come from higher income households and will be able to pay more in tithe than others. And that's great, but that is not what Jesus cares about. What Jesus cares about is the heart behind what we give. So what does this mean for us today? And how can we find transformation in our mindset when it comes to finance? Well, the Apostle Paul says that as Christians, we should be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And I think when it comes to finance, there are three particular areas where we can renew and we can transform our mindset to change how we approach what we do with our cash. And the first one is that I believe we need to transform how we think about ownership, first of all. So when we think about things as our property, it becomes much more difficult to give them up. If we think we own something, we think we've earned something. But actually the Bible teaches us that every good gift comes from God. We read that in James 1. Every good gift comes from God. And actually, if we start to think like that, and if we start to count every blessing in our lives as a gift from God, then suddenly giving back, let's say for argument's sake, 1/10 of that, it doesn't seem like such a bad deal, really. It actually seems like a pretty good deal to me, if we can adopt that change in mindset. So that's the first one. And then secondly, we need to transform our mindset on suffering as well. And another thing that the Apostle Paul writes in the book of Romans is that we should rejoice in our sufferings, which is, at face value, quite an unusual phrase. But the relevance here with our finances is that actually if we need to feel the pinch a little bit sometimes in order to be faithful in our giving, then we should find joy in that. And if we need to, on occasion, sacrifice something else, that holiday, that trip, that shopping spree, whatever it might be, in order to really put Jesus at the center of our finances, then actually we have to find joy in that. And that's really countercultural. So it does require a transformation of mindset, but we should find joy in it because we know, therefore, that we are putting the creator of the universe at the center of every aspect of our lives, including our finances. And then thirdly, as Beth kind of spoke about last week, we also need to find a transformation in our mindset when it comes to eternity. As Jesus says in that passage we read together at the very start, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And the thing we really need to understand is that being faithful in our finances is worth so much more than anything else our money could physically buy. Being faithful in our finances here on this earth and looking forward to the eternity that we get to spend with God in heaven. As Christians, we have that promise. And that just cannot compare to anything that our money might buy right here. And for the record, I don't think there's anything wrong with being career-driven. I don't think there's anything wrong with being ambitious. I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to build a good life for yourself and your family. But it's all about priority, perspective, and heart. And there is a danger that we can fall into this mindset of, actually, when I have more, I'll give more. Or actually, once I'm earning more, I'll then be able to position tithes in a bigger priority in my monthly spend. And we can sometimes start to think like this, but something else that Stephen Foster said really struck a chord with me, because I actually think that's nonsense. I think that whole mindset is nonsense, because as Stephen says, money doesn't change us. Money doesn't change who we are. Money actually magnifies who we are. So today, if we find it hard to be generous with the little that we have, then, the chances are, if in the future we have more, we're going to equally struggle to be generous with that. And that's why this mindset of eternity, this transformational mindset, is something that we need to embrace. So when it comes to finances, we need to be transformed in our minds around ownership, around suffering, and around eternity. And I want to finish by saying something that Marcus may kill me for later. He won't. But I want to say, kind of on behalf of the leadership team here at Living Well, that we do not want your money. Our heart is not to have your money so that we can pay the bills here at church and buy nicer seats and buy flashier lights and whatever else it might be. Like, that is not our heart for why you guys should tithe. And actually, if you're here today and you are a committed Christian and you attend here regularly and you don't tithe and nothing I say this morning will ever change that mindset, then that's fine. And actually, God will look after us. And I believe God is the ultimate provider. And we've seen in generation on generation in this church that God provides, and God has led us through some really challenging financial seasons in the past. So we'll be fine, and God will take care of us. So we don't want your money for that. But we do really want you to tithe for one really important reason. And that is because it is a biblical thing to do. That is because it is a Jesus-centered thing to do. And that's because it's really good for us to do that. You know, I haven't always got this right. As I've told you, I've had seasons in the past where I've struggled with this myself. But I can honestly say that I've never ever regretted a single penny that I gave to the church. I've never ever regretted that. But I have, on several occasions, really regretted not doing the right thing with my money and not giving enough of it back to God. And so today I would say that if you don't tithe, you should start. You really should start. Because actually we cannot stand in front of the mirror and say to God, we are committed to you. You are the center of our lives. And yet not honor him with the one thing that man craves more than anything else, which is our money. So I'd encourage you to start. And it's not for me to tell you how much you should give. Maybe a tenth is unrealistic and isn't possible right now. Then start with something smaller. But commit to it. Honor God with it every month. Make it the first thing that you do rather than the last thing that you do with your money in the month. And just see what God does in your heart as a result of that. And maybe you do tithe. Maybe you have done for a long time. Maybe you tithe a tenth already. And actually you don't feel the cost or the impact of that. Maybe it's become a little bit transactional. And maybe this morning God is actually challenging you to kind of trust him with more. To take a step of faith and trust him with a little bit more. And if that's you, then I'd encourage you to prayerfully consider what he's asking you to do. But if we are serious about our faith, we cannot ignore this. And Jesus sees our hearts in it all. And if you're here today and actually you're new with us, or you've never made that commitment to follow Jesus, then you don't need to worry about this right now. You know, I believe this becomes really important when we make a decision that we want to put Jesus at the center of our lives. And if you're new here, if you're a visitor, we're just so pleased you're here. Yeah, we do not want your money. We're not after your money. But if you want to talk to myself or Neil or anybody else afterwards about, you know, why we think this is important, and you want to go into a bit more detail with us, then we'd love to chat that through with you. Or maybe just something that I've said this morning has struck a chord with you. You know, maybe you feel that sort of pressure of living paycheck to paycheck and really money being the driving force behind your life. And maybe you want something bigger than that. Maybe you want something more important than that to live for and to lay down your life for. And if that's you, then I'd love to chat with you afterwards. But if you're in that first group and actually you want to do something about that, then Amy's here, our office manager. You can talk to me, you can talk to Neil, and that we have a whole different bunch of ways that you can contribute financially to the church. Some people do it by direct debit, some people do online payments, some people do it on a Sunday, but we can chat you through those different options. But I'd really encourage you today to pray about what it is that God's saying to you. Amen.